Just to say by way of introduction, I've been involved in Portugal since 1995. Despite my appearance, I'm quite old. And since that time, almost by luck at times, but also because of collaboration with various partners, I've been involved in a whole series of initiatives in Portugal, um, projects, research studies, conferences, and so on. And so, as I've been going along, obviously, I've been reflecting on the developments in Portugal. I think I'd want to also say, by way of introduction, I'm not setting up as Portugal is the perfect place to go as far as inclusion is concerned. Of course, it's on a journey, as every one of our countries are. That said, I think I would say, as somebody who's spent a lot of time studying these issues in different parts of the world, I think Portugal has made enormous progress, and I think it can be an inspiration to us, and I think it can also help us to think about what we do in our own place. I think another thing that I've learned about all of this is that context matters. So that means what works in one place might not work in another. That said, I think we can learn by visiting and hearing about what happens in other parts of the world. So, in that spirit, is what I'm going to talk about. What I think I've learned from Portugal, linking it to other places, and inviting you to think about what this means for the places where you work. I set my interest, of course, in relation to all this in terms of Sustainable Development Goal 4. As you know, going back to 1990, the United Nations organizations have had a whole series of initiatives that have tried to promote forms of education, which we now talk about as being inclusive and equitable. Probably a major turning point in that respect was 2016 with the publication of the Sustainable Development Goals. And Sustainable Development Goal 4, as you know, is the one that is concerned with education. As part of my work with UNESCO in 2017, I chaired a group of international experts who came together to design a guide. And that's the guide that's on the screen, a guide for ensuring inclusion and equity in education. It's available in a series of languages on the UNESCO website. So if you Google it, you will find it. And what it's meant to do is it provides a kind of framework of indicators and questions which can be used in a country or in a district or in a province to look at a system and say, what do we need to move the system forward? And of course, that is my agenda. That's what I think about and work on all the time. The group came up with this rather helpful motto, if you like. It's really a principle, and it's what guides all my work. Every learner matters and matters equally. So when I'm working with groups of schools, as I do sometimes, or with individuals or with countries, that is the kind of principle that's in my mind. Every learner matters and matters equally. Definitions are crucial in all of this. What we know from lots of international research is education systems are amongst the most difficult social institutions to change. Not because people are resistant or lazy, of course some are, but more because the really key people in all of this, in education change, are very busy. And of course, the most important people in all of this are teachers. It's teachers who are the policymakers as far as children are concerned. So if we're to move a policy forward, we have to take people with us, and we need to have clarity. Now, terms like inclusion and equity in themselves, I think, can create barriers because they're jargon, they're language that people like me use, but do they speak to the most important people, teachers, families, children, and young people? So, what I've thought about for a long time and keep changing my mind, I might change my mind again this afternoon, is how do I see the process of inclusion? I've called it taking an inclusive turn. What that implies is moving in a new direction. So, this is what my version of that inclusion turn is. My view is that inclusion is a process, not a state. It's a journey, if you will, and it's a never-ending journey. And when I sometimes work with schools that are well down the road in that journey, sometimes I'll talk to them about being an inclusive school. And very often people in those schools will say, we're not an inclusive school. We're trying to be, we're moving in that direction, but we still have new children come along that make us have to think again. So the idea is that inclusion is a process, a journey. Logically, therefore, it probably is the case. I don't want to be depressing, but it is the case. We will never have an inclusive school. It's an impossible dream, if you will, because there'll always be new children, new young people who come along who have new challenges that we have to address. So that's the first thing I want to say about it. It's a process. It's about identifying and removing barriers. Now, the word barriers, which gets mentioned a lot in the international literature, including Sustainable Development Goal 4, is quite crucial to my understanding of inclusion. And I need to just explain what I mean by barriers. You see, the curriculum can be a barrier if it's not designed with all children in mind. The assessment systems we use for celebrating progress can be a barrier if they don't celebrate the progress of those children who are making relatively slow progress. And of course, our teaching methods can be a barrier if we're not able to design and orchestrate, organize a classroom where all children can feel that they are valued and can take part. Some of the most difficult barriers, of course, difficult to identify and difficult to move, are the barriers in our mind. If we don't really believe that it's possible to create a school and a classroom where all children can participate and learn, then of course it's unlikely we will make progress. Now, here's the key issue in all of this, which I invite you to think about. I am not talking about barriers within children. I am not talking about barriers within families. Of course, I recognize there are difficulties in the real world, but for the purposes of bringing about change, I am talking about contextual barriers. What are the things that go on in a school or an education system that need to be identified and addressed in order to create a more welcoming environment for all children? So that's my understanding of barriers. And I think within the field, that can be quite challenging to many people, certainly people that I meet. Then I think tactically, it's quite useful to think about inclusion, the journey, the process, in terms of three broad stages. It's about presence, being there in the school, being there in the classroom. But of course, you can be present and you might be ignored and overlooked. Your voice might not be heard. You're almost invisible in the school. So you're seen as being a significant member of the school and the class community. But even that's insufficient because you can be present and participating, and you might not be learning anything that's useful to you. So the ultimate goal of inclusion, as far as I'm concerned, the nirvana, if you will, is achievement. It's about the achievement of all students. Now, why this is so crucial, and it'll be crucial in terms of when I say a little about Portugal in a moment, the implication of this is that this is about school improvement. School improvement with attitude, if you like. School improvement based on the sort of principles I mentioned earlier. Every learner matters and matters equally. So this is not a separate project to the overall project of educational improvement, school development. It is the project as far as I'm concerned. And therefore, for me, inclusion is about all students. It's about all students. And I say that in a very practical way because in some of the schools I work with here in the UK, for example, sometimes teachers, as a result of the research they're doing with our help, will identify some children who are invisible. These, particularly in the secondary schools, often girls. They're not on any list. They're not seen as vulnerable. They come to school every day. But when you talk to them, they say, nobody seems to know who I am. The teachers don't know my name. When I put my hand up, nobody asks me to respond. So this is why my focus is on all students. But of course, history teaches us that some groups are more at risk than others. And so I think we have a moral duty to keep an eye on those. But we again have to be cautious about that. Who are the most at-risk students? They vary from place to place. In various parts of Africa, for example, it's often the girls who are most vulnerable, particularly when they get to the ages of 11 or 12, when they're working at home, or maybe they're even getting married. In my country, in England, the most vulnerable students, statistically, are white working class boys living in very poor homes, usually on public housing estates. They're the ones that underperform. They're the ones that often become excluded from school. So what I'm saying is we do need to keep an eye on the at-risk groups, but we have to keep our eyes open for others who may be vulnerable. So that's my version of inclusion, and there are many versions, and that's part of the problem. If we can't agree what we're trying to achieve, how will we make progress? So let's turn to Portugal. In 2021-22, I was part of a group that was invited by the OECD to do a review of inclusive education. And this review was carried out partly at the invitation of the Portuguese government. it was during the period just as COVID was finishing, so it was quite difficult, and some of our research was done online. We did a lot of interviewing, but then we were able to spend time in Portugal and we visited schools in different parts of the country. So obviously, as I was taking part in this work, I was kind of learning more about things I'd already learnt since my involvement starting in 1995. Now, I think for me, the most crucial lesson that I take for Portugal, and it links to what I've already said, that the reason they seem to have made a lot of progress over quite a lot of years, and that's to be underlined, I think, is that inclusion is not seen as a policy. It's not seen as a policy, it's seen as a principle that guides all policy. You see, if you decide to make inclusion a policy, it becomes somebody's job. This person or this group are set up to guide the policy of inclusion. But I'm describing inclusion as a principle that has to inform all policies. Therefore, it has to be everybody's job. Now, I think in terms of what's happened in Portugal, that's been made pretty clear going back quite a few years through the legislation, and I think through the kind of implementation of that legislation in policy. So that's a key factor for me. And sometimes, as I do in different parts of the world, I get to meet with policymakers. I say to them, don't have a policy for inclusion. And I can see them kind of flinch when I say that. And I say, don't have a policy. Make it a principle. A principle informs the curriculum, that informs the assessment system, that informs the budget, that informs teacher education, and so on and so forth. It's a principle. So inclusion has to permeate everything within a system. Now, of all the places I've been in the world, and it's a fair number, I have to say, Portugal is the one, in my view, that has made most progress in relation to that idea. And that's the crucial thing from Portugal. But then there are some practical things that have come out from it. Of course, I'd want to say from my involvement in Portugal, particularly in the OECD study, one became aware, understandably, that there is variation across the country, as there will be in any country. There's variation, some good, some bad, some not so good, you know? And so these lessons I'm drawing, I'm not saying for 1 minute they're there in every school and every district of Portugal, but I've seen enough good examples to know that they are important factors in moving a system forward. The first thing is about leadership, and clearly leadership is crucial to all of this. Now, the striking thing about leadership in Portugal is how democratically it is organised. So, for example, the school directors, the school principals, in England we would call them head teachers, they're elected by representatives of the community, including families, and they're elected for 4 years. And they might be elected for another 4 years, and then that's finished. So those people who become the directors of the school are very much answerable to the community. I remember in one school, I said to the school director, I said to him, who are you accountable to? And he had very good English, but he clearly didn't know what I meant. And I said, who are you accountable? And he thought for a few minutes and he said, the committee who'd answered him. So here, I mean, this is very different, certainly to my country, where we certainly don't have the election of what we call head teachers. So the dynamics of the school, I think, to some extent, are created by all of that. And again, I'm not saying that always works perfectly. And I can remember thinking over many years that in some ways this can be a kind of barrier to progress. Because if you know you're going to have to be re-elected after 4 years, possibly as a leader, you won't necessarily want to make too many changes. You won't want to disturb too many people. But nevertheless, from our observations and talking with people in the school, the sense of that democratic appointment seems to be an important factor in all of this. Another factor that I've seen in various parts of Portugal is the way in which evidence is used to stimulate professional development and indeed school development. Now, when I say evidence, I mean different kind of things. Of course, it often starts with statistics, and statistics are a very good starting point. But of course, research methodologists will tell you every method has its strength, every method has its weakness. Statistics are very good at showing you what things look like, but they don't tell you why. So if you want to change things, you want to develop your school community, as well as statistics, you need qualitative evidence. Particularly, you need to hear voices, the voices of teachers, the voices of students, the voices of families. Now, in the best examples that I've seen in Portugal and indeed in other places, it's that kind of inquiry-based professional development stimulated by an engagement with evidence that brings people together to say, what can we do here? Particularly for those children who we're not reaching at the moment. So it creates a kind of dynamic of development based on evidence. Linked to that, the best practice that I've seen in Portugal, and again elsewhere, is very much about partnerships, cooperation. All schools in Portugal are in cluster groups, local groupings. Some are small, some are slightly bigger, but they're area-based clusters. And in my view, this is a very powerful means of providing the kind of mutual support that you need to move schools in an inclusive direction. And there's evidence that my colleagues and I have collected from various parts of the world, again, here in the UK as well, to show that these kind of area partnerships, when they work, and they don't always work, when they work, they're a good means of supporting the individual school. Now, what's happened in Portugal is gradually, as the separate special provision was closed down and the children and the adults were integrated into the clusters, then of course within the partnerships, there are the children, there are the teachers, there are the families, but there are also quite a lot of experts, educational psychologists, speech therapists, people with a background in special education, but they're no longer separate. They're there as part of what goes on in the school. And they create teams so that particularly where there's a concern about a particular child, the team will meet together to discuss what they know about the child and what needs to happen. So when this works well, what this is creating is a kind of problem-solving organization where people come together to share ideas within the school and then in the cluster between the schools. I'm absolutely convinced that this is crucial. I think more could be done in Portugal on this issue, and in our report we make reference to that. But there's plenty of good examples of it. And I think one of the recommendations we made in the report is that more effort needs to be made to move expertise around within the country. We interviewed some people who were doing fantastic things, but we were not convinced that their experiences, their expertise, their ideas was being shared. So one of the things I think we recommended was that more needs to be done to encourage more of this collaboration within the partnerships, but between the partnerships. Some of it goes on, but I think more of it could happen. Then there's the whole role of the wider community. I've said already about their involvement in the appointment of the director. In the best examples that we saw, the involvement, particularly of families, of course, but also other groups in the community, local businesses, universities, faith church organizations. All of these, I think, can also make a contribution. And there are excellent examples in Portugal. And that's another example of where I think more could be done to celebrate those examples, but also share them around so that other parts of the country can deal with each other. One of the things that we recommended in the report was that perhaps more needs to be done, particularly at the kind of regional level, to make these links between different activities going on, but it could also happen at the national level. And so, in terms of going back to policy, I think what seems to have been very successful in Portugal is that through the legislation that's been carried out over the last 20 years, it's created spaces for local action. It's created a stimulus for local action. And of course, it's created those principles, these key ideas that everybody can work together. And I think that's a crucial area that needs to be built upon. I often say this is about the collective will to make it happen. In places that make progress, of course, it's about ideas, about practical suggestions, but more than anything else, it's a social process. People coming together and saying, we want the best for our children and we're going to make it happen. And of course, takes you back to the issue of leadership. So that's my sort of final point, really. The most important lesson I think I take from Portugal is this progress they've made in terms of creating a collective will to make it happen. In terms of the next stages, and Portuguese colleagues will be more up to date than I am with this, there are clearly still big challenges in Portugal. The link between economic disadvantage and outcomes is still there, as it is in every European country. And despite the progress that's made, that I think is something that still needs to be addressed. There is variation across the country. There's no doubt about that. In some parts of the country, they've made more progress than others, which supports the argument that there needs to be more moving of knowledge around across the country and across the particular areas of the country. Particular groups that remain vulnerable, I am told by Portuguese colleagues, is a considerable worries about the Roma community. And we spoke to some of the representatives of the Roma community, and they clearly are a resource and want to support the government and practitioners in moving things forward. But they have traditionally been a marginalised group and remain so. So that group, and then there's a whole issue of people coming from other countries, and like other European countries, Portugal gets a lot of immigration, including, of course, quite a lot of families who already speak Portuguese, which is a bit of an advantage if they've already got the language. This thing about diversity, I think, is an important issue that we need to think about as well in terms of how this is conceptualized. See, I live and work most of the time in the city of Manchester. So it was the first industrial city in the north of England. And somebody did some research a few years back, and they worked out that something like 150 languages are spoken amongst the children in Manchester School. 150 languages. 60% of the children are bilingual. They speak one language at home with their parents, and they speak English in the schools. Now, for many years, that was seen as an enormous problem. And of course, it still can be a problem. But what's happened is, as the system has matured in its capacity to engage with differences, gradually those differences of language, culture, religion have become a stimulus to innovation. And I'm rightly proud of the city schools, and it's true of other schools in cities in England, London, Birmingham, Leeds, in those very diverse communities. As we have learned how to live with differences and learn from differences, it's stimulated innovation and development. So I think the collective will to make it happen includes the collective will to learn from differences. As was said at the beginning by Diana, all of this is written in more details in this book that was published last year and is now available through Narcia in Spanish. In the book, late on in the book, I think it's in the final chapter, I have a section particularly on Portugal, and I develop the arguments I've heard before. And because it's a country I know very well and work with, I also compare Portugal with the Netherlands. Both relatively small countries, reasonably well developed, but very different education systems. In the Netherlands, it's well resourced, teachers are well paid, people are very enthusiastic, but it's very fragmented and segregated system. They have a very large proportion, relatively large proportion of their learners in separate provision compared with many other parts of Europe. So here's a country that's invested in education, there's no doubt about it, a very pro-education community, but somehow they've gone down the road of segregation and dealing with difference in that way. In the book, I contrast that with Portugal, where clearly they've learned to learn from differences, and I think that's what's taken them forward.